All right, we are recording and I'll share my screen.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, we're good to go.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Stormwater Utility Information Forum. My name is Dana Patterson, and I am the co-chair of the Jersey Waterworks Stormwater Utility Subcommittee, as well as the Director of Marketing Communications for Princeton Hydro. We are very excited to have you all join us today for this session and hopefully for our future sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our host organization, Jersey Waterworks. Jersey Waterworks is a collaborative effort of many diverse organizations and individuals who embrace the common purpose of transforming New Jersey's water infrastructure. We bring together people to find equitable solutions focused on clean water and waterways, healthier, safer neighborhoods, local jobs, flood and climate resilience, and economic growth. Jersey Waterworks consists of many different committees run by volunteers, including our Stormwater Utility Subcommittee, which is part of our Asset Management and Finance Committee. So our subcommittee has been working for a number of years, and we felt it was our duty to provide educational resources for policymakers, municipal officials, utility leaders on stormwater utilities. And so we created this forum so that we can bring the stormwater utility experts to you and serve as a resource to the community. So we've put together this series of sessions to introduce you to this concept of a stormwater utility. And today's session on stormwater financial planning and funding options is the second session in our series. For each session, we'll be hearing from our experts who will give a short 15-minute to 20-minute presentation and followed by an active Q&A discussion. So I just wanted to give a shout out for those of us who joined us last month for our first session, which was on utility concept, New Jersey legislation, and utility development process. The presentation portion of this session was recorded. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we can share that link in the chat if you'd like to watch it. It's also posted on our website. And then next month, we'll dive into stormwater utility policies, and following that, we will have sessions on stormwater rate structures and credits, as well as stakeholder engagement. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for those remaining sessions and that you walk away from these sessions with a deeper understanding of what a stormwater utility is, how it works, and how your community might benefit from one. But before we get started, just a couple of ground rules and logistics to review. As I mentioned before, we will be recording the presentation components of this session only. So these are posted on our website for future reference. And we did this strategically, elected to not record the question and answer portion so that folks can feel comfortable asking questions and discussing topics openly. We do ask that you respect others and keep the conversations from the discussion portion confidential to these sessions. As we go through, please feel free to post your questions in the chat as they pop up. However, we're not going to answer any questions until the presentation is finished, but get those questions in the queue and we will address them after the presentation. And we're really hoping that this session can be more of a conversation, especially during the Q&A portion. So if you'd like to join in, please post your comment again in the chat, or you can also, I believe, raise your hand on the Zoom here. So now I'd like to introduce our two experts and really key organizers of this forum who are presenting today. We have Elizabeth Treadway of WSP and Prabha Kumar of Black and Beach. These two ladies are national experts. So you have at your hands like two people that are really leading the charge on stormwater utilities. They've been working for years and years across the nation on utilities and have implemented and gone through the feasibility study process for dozens and dozens of them. So use them, ask them the questions. They know stormwater utilities inside and out, and this is really the resource that we'd like to provide to you today. I'd also like to just acknowledge a couple of other people that are present today. We have Lindsay Sigmund and Patricia Dunkirk of New Jersey Future. They have been leading the Jersey Waterworks Stormwater Utility Subcommittee and have been backbones. Tricia serves as our liaison for the committee specifically and have really helped organize all of these sessions. And then Micah Shapiro is my co-chair of the Stormwater Utility Subcommittee. He couldn't join us today, but he's also part of these series. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth and Prabha, who are going to walk through the topic for today.
Elizabeth, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think it's helpful if I actually unmute myself, isn't it?
Go ahead.
We're delighted that you're with us today, and that for those of you who were in our session in June, welcome back. Today we're going to focus around funding planning, what goes into building the funding strategy for a utility. And the very first thing we want to emphasize is the importance of doing due diligence in establishing an enterprise operation such as a utility. So we don't start with the end in mind. We don't start with, oh, I need $500,000. Oh, I don't know, maybe if I got $1 million, I could do something. We start with, why are you doing this? Understand what is driving you to generate new revenue. Is it the aging infrastructure? Is it flooding mitigation? And if you're thinking that a utility is going to somehow conquer a massive flood from a hurricane, I'm sorry, that's typically not the outcome. But in building resilience in your drainage infrastructure, it's extremely important. So are you facing new regulations? Is your infrastructure aging? Have you seen things that are occurring that are on a water quality side that you want to be able to take care of? Those are the important things that you're going to ask yourself. You're going to quantify them ultimately and turn them into a financial model. But you first want to really understand, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? So let's take a look at a process in the next slide that allows you to focus on those very questions that will bring together a compelling case for implementing a user fee. So understanding what you're currently funding, what activities are ongoing today, where are they occurring in your organization, and what are those future operational needs that you are facing? The cost of MS4 implementation from your permit, that may be a very large driver that's there. But understanding both operating and then to define, what capital needs do you have? What is the age of your infrastructure? Where do you see failing points? Are there sections of your community that have no infrastructure? We're seeing a lot of that actually across the United States. Understand then what it's going to take to run this utility from an implementation perspective. There are some one-time costs in the very process of adopting the utility that can be recouped through the revenue generated by the utility itself. So you are allowed to, for example, borrow internally from a different fund. Use those resources to create your utility, then repay yourself from the revenues of the utility. What are those one-time expenses that you need to be thinking about? That leads to then a forecast. If you understand what you're currently spending and what you need to be spending and what it's going to take you to implement this utility, you have the ability then to look at, what is the revenue requirement that you're going to have going forward. That allows you to ask yourself the question, how am I going to pay for this? Is the user fee the answer? Is a user fee in combination with grants, with debt service, with partnership with other agencies? What is it that you can use in order to meet that long-term financial target? And that allows you then to actually quantify and build your financial plan. The important output of all this effort, what are you doing now? Why do you need to change? What does it cost you? What will it cost you? Is building this compelling case. It again underwrites the fact that you've done your due diligence. You understand what's going on in your organization. You know what you need to move forward. So we're often asked, well, what costs can be covered? Let's take a look at that in the next slide. This is an inventory of kind of all the things that are possible that could be called stormwater. They exist all over your organization. They're not typically confined within one place. You could find them in public works. You could find them in planning. You could find them in your finance office. You could find them in an engineering department. You could find them in the manager's office. There are a variety of places that revenue is needed, expenditures occur that impact stormwater. So you start with the broadest evaluation of what's stormwater. In our next session in August, we're going to talk a lot about critical policies. One of those critical policies is, then what are you going to fund? How do you get from, we have all of these activities that could be going on across various departments, bureaus in your agency. What is it then that you're really going to fund? But using something like this functional evaluation helps you broaden the perspective and realize that the utility can give you resources in order to establish your program. And this does not mean, a utility does not mean we have to reorganize. We have to move all these people into one place. No, you don't. Your financial planning can allow you to outsource resources to another department. There will be one location that is the manager of the utility, but it does not require you to do some wholesale reorganization. So once you've looked at what you spend, where is it being spent, what your future looks like, then we're going to move into, and the next slide captures this message, the evaluation of that level of service that you're going to put into the utility program going forward. What is your ongoing operating costs? What are your future operating costs? Make sure that you've evaluated then not just capital needs. And I've seen communities think about this only as capital. If we can just get some capital money. Capital money is great. It can solve some very important problems, but capital money without ongoing maintenance and operation typically means a future where that capital is not going to perform. Those investments will not perform over time, and you're back into the, we're not maintaining our ongoing infrastructure. So keep your horizon broadened, look at both areas, build your cost model that will take into consideration all of those things that require consideration for ongoing maintenance and operation, and then take a look at your capital. Do you have a green infrastructure plan? Are there best management practices that you need to get funded? Are there multi-beneficial resiliency projects that can address more than stormwater within the community? My own community right now is building a stormwater park in which during non-rain conditions is an amenity to the community. But when it rains, and it can rain a lot in a very short period of time, as you've all probably experienced, it turns into a stormwater management feature. Very innovative thinking, multi-purpose outcome. Make sure your drainage system is going to operate for your future. So let's take a look in our next slide, the actual process of building to the future. You've forecasted where you want to go. You've looked at all your drainage issues and methods to resolve them. You've looked at beyond merely the capital side, but you're looking at operating costs, people, general resources, equipment. You're going to take all of that into consideration in building your model. You're also then going to think about who can execute the work that needs to be done. Is it in-house? Is it in partnership with an agency that is right next door, a neighboring community, or multiple communities? You may share resources to benefit all. Is it something that has to be contracted? It's a skill set that maybe short-term, one-time mapping activity. Great example. So you understand then what is going to be done and you build your forecast. 5 years is a good first step opening window. With enough data over time, you can forecast out that 10-year model. We see our water and sewer friends forecasting out 100 years. We need to build the history before we're able to do that. So as we're looking at the future, let's see what it actually can look like. The next slide shows you, and this is an old image. I didn't want to pick on a particularly current community. So I'm merely representing ways in which you can organize your information in your financial model. In this case, it's organized by function, not by budget categories. It's not organized by personnel. It's not organized by general operating expenses or capital. It's organized by what are we trying to accomplish and what does it cost to make those things happen. A lot of what we've been talking about in building this, it really is well established within the industry and focuses a lot on municipal separate storm sewer systems. But we're going to pick up now and we're going to talk about the fact that even in New Jersey, a lot of our eastern communities, we see a combined sewer system that also has a stormwater component that needs to be addressed. So Prabha, let's pick it up from here and focus on a combined system.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. So when we talk about, Elizabeth talked a lot about the components of the stormwater program and the chart that she showed with the various functional components of the program. Now, it's not a one size fits all. Now, some of those components, as she said, can reside in different departments, but it's not only a matter of where things are residing and what departments they are residing, but we also, when we talk New Jersey specifically, we have to look at what are the systems we have. If you look at New Jersey, fundamentally, there are two types of systems. There are utilities like Newark, New Jersey, Hoboken, where the stormwater really runs through the sanitary sewer system as well. So these are systems where you have both a combined, certain areas of the jurisdiction have combined sewer systems. Some parts of the jurisdiction have separate storm sewer systems and separate sanitary sewer systems. And of course, all of these entities have green initiatives going on as well. So when you have a system like that, so for example, let's focus on these communities that have combined sewer systems. How do you then develop stormwater program costs that Elizabeth was talking about? Because in these systems, first question is, what are they responsible for? So a utility like Newark, New Jersey may be responsible not only for their sanitary sewer, but they're also responsible for MS4 activities. However, part of the stormwater comes through their combined sewer system and part of the stormwater comes through their separate storm sewer system, which is their MS4 system. So what you have to then really look at is, are there any costs that are, and all of these costs may be currently, the next question is, where are all these costs currently accounted for? So all of these costs may be currently accounted for under one bucket called the wastewater, because that's how historically it has been. So that's how it's probably accounted for. Then you really have to look at the wastewater budget, and then you have to do what is called a bifurcation. You have to use some technical analysis to bifurcate the existing wastewater costs between sanitary sewer and stormwater. It's not only bifurcating the operations and maintenance costs, but it is also bifurcating the capital costs. If there is debt service, even that has to be bifurcated between sanitary sewer and stormwater costs. Now, that whole notion of how do you do that technical bifurcation, that's a topic in itself. So we're not going to go into detail on that, but just be aware that those cost bifurcations should be done. So then, in addition to that, utilities, like I said, like Newark, for example, they have their own separate storm sewer areas as well, and where they have MS4 responsibilities. So then those costs have to be identified, and those costs also have to be added, so that then in aggregate, then you can develop the stormwater costs that you see in the green box. So that's what really this chart illustrates. So this is an important aspect of communities that have both combined sewer systems and separate storm sewer systems. Okay, so once we do that, now let's talk about what should a financial plan include. So we talked a lot about the last 10 minutes about how to develop the program cost for the existing level of service and the future level of service that a utility would like to transition to. Just determining the program cost itself is not a financial plan. The program cost is really a building block. So once you develop the program cost for the operations and maintenance costs, then that's where you really look at what are the recurring costs, what are the one-time costs that Elizabeth talked about. So an example of a one-time cost would be, let's say you have really not done an activity at all and you want to ramp up, let's say inlet cleaning, you've really not done that at all and you want to ramp up. And so you may decide, hey, in the next couple of years, I'm going to ramp it up significantly, and then I'm going to bring it to a steady state. So those are all things that you have to look at in the projection of the O&M cost. Once you do that, then that's your one building block. Then the next building block, as Elizabeth talked about, is a capital program. You look at a 5-year capital program to say, what am I doing right now? What do I want to do in the next 5 years, for example? What would be my annual expenditures? And then there's a decision you have to make there. Am I going to completely fund the capital program through cash financing, or am I going to do a balancing of some level of cash financing, some debt financing, and are there any potential for grant money that I can leverage? Then you bring it all together and really develop what is called a cash financing analysis. And that will then tell you what should your projection of debt service, future debt service would be, and what is, in case you already have existing debt service, what is that existing debt service? And are you going to do some cash financing of capital? This is important because, why is this important? It's important because if you do decide that all of the capital program in the next 5 years, you're going to do cash financing of capital just because you're going to... Did somebody have anything to say? Okay. So if you determine that you're going to do cash financing of capital just because you have a stormwater utility, what it's going to do, it's immediately going to put a burden on the rates. So that is why you have to balance cash financing and debt service, because if you try to do some level of debt service, whether it is a general, typically when you're starting afresh, the only thing you could potentially do is a general obligation bond, not a revenue bond. So when you're doing that, then that helps you balance out the amortization of the debt service. So you have to really balance cash financing and debt financing. Okay, that once you build those 3 components, that's just not all. Then you have to look at, operating and maintenance reserve. Any good financial planning practice, whether you're doing it for a water utility or a sewer utility or a stormwater utility, the principles are the same. You also look at potential building at least a modest level of operations and maintenance reserve, so that if there are any catastrophic emergencies, you could have something to address them. And then depending on your individual community and your charter, you may have, sometimes we have seen communities that has a mandatory transfer that may have to be done to the general fund for things like pilot or other ordinances that they may have internally, other policies they may have. So you have to look at whether are there any mandatory transfers that a stormwater utility has to do internally. But here in New Jersey, the enabling legislation also requires a stormwater utility to do a transfer to NJDEP. So there's a threshold, and if you meet the threshold, then you have to do some transfer to the NJDEP from the stormwater utility revenue. So that has to be considered in the total financial planning mix. And lastly, you also have to look at when you are establishing a user fee program, which is the context of what we are presenting here. When you're establishing a user fee program, you always have to be aware you may not get 100% collection of what you bill. So therefore, you may have to have some allowance for reduction in your revenues in the form of a bad debt reduction. So all of that has to be put together in a meaningful financial plan. And so the key thing to really take away here, both from what Elizabeth talked about and what I'm talking here, is that you don't have to feel that everything has to be put into one big soup pot. No, the key thing to take away here is that the stormwater program and the financial plan can grow over time. So start in a very practical, pragmatic way as to what the community can afford, and then build it up from there so that, as the program evolves, then your funding mechanism also evolves. So that's how the financial plan should really be structured as well. So going on, so here's an example. So the chart that Elizabeth showed was just the program cost development, but now this is a chart that shows really what we call a financial plan cash flow analysis. So here's an example where at the top, you're really starting with the expenditures. You've projected the O&M expenditures, then you project the capital expenditures. And again, when we talk about capital expenditures, that's where you look at, is it just going to be debt financed? Is there going to be some level of cash financing, any kind of reserves? So you take all of that, and then that tells you in the blue line that you see what's the total operating and capital fund expenditure. So it gives you a projection of what the annual expenditures are. So in this example, it goes from 4.5 million to 5 million to 6 million to 10 million. So that is something that you have to think through, because now from when you look at 21 through 22, we intentionally kind of presented this. You really have to ask a question, even if it is out in the out years, can you go from 6 million to 10 million? Because that's a big jump, or do you have to gradually phase that in over a longer period of time? Those are all practical decisions that you would have to really see. And if you look at why is that jumping from 6 million to 10 million, you would see in the second line that the capital expenditure is going from $1 million to $3.3 million. So those are something, especially smaller communities, have to look at, can we go that fast, or do we have to take it a little more gradually? That's really kind of a balancing act. Once you have your projection of expenditures, then of course comes revenues. Then you have to look at, okay, do I have any existing money already from some sources that I have as a balance? If you have, obviously you should leverage it. And then you look at, are there any other receipts that I can count on to come? It might be in the form of really a grant or some developer contribution, or even sometimes we have seen where, you know, some other revenues, like in some utilities where I've worked on, they would say, okay, temporarily, we are going to continue to support certain amount of money from the general fund. And if that is the case, yeah, leverage whatever you can, so that then that becomes your other revenue that you can all account for. And then, so then you really begin to look at the net revenue requirement. So you see in that gray line, the net revenue requirement, which is the expenditures minus any other source of revenue. So that's kind of that line that you see gray is the line that you still need to get that money from somewhere, in this case, the stormwater utility. But before you finalize those numbers, that's where, as I talked before, you still look at potential bad debt and any reduction you're going to give to customers in the form of stormwater credits or any other offset. Take that all into consideration so that you can then get the final net revenue requirement, which is what you see in the green line. So that net revenue requirement essentially is the funding gap that Elizabeth showed in the early part of the presentation. That's the funding gap now you're estimating that you have to fulfill establishing a stormwater user fee program, stormwater charge program. So that's how you have to look at. So the key takeaway here is that the reason for this 5-year financial plan is to not only look at the immediate 2-3 years, but having a lens into what's coming down the pike in year 5, in year 6, so that if it is inevitable that in year 5 or 6, because of certain regulatory requirement or otherwise, that you have to have some substantial boost of revenues, then you need to start thinking about it 3-4 years ahead, so that suddenly in year 5, you're not creating a spike. The second takeaway is that when you're establishing a user fee program for the first time, one of the key things to understand is to the extent that you can keep the rates a little bit stable, at least for the first 2-3 years, almost having the same rate the first 2-3 years really helps it get it off the ground, so that the customers can adjust to the rates, non-residential properties can adjust in terms of their budget, school districts and everybody who has to develop budget for the stormwater user charge, they can all adjust and be prepared for that budget. So keeping it a little bit of a steady state the first 2-3 years is very helpful. And that's why you see, and so that there won't be a big spike up and down when you're establishing the rates. That's why you see even in this analysis, at least the first 3 years is relatively pretty stable at $4.75 million. Okay. So that's how we develop the plan. So to kind of summarize all this, the key facts to consider when developing a financial plan, typically just like we do in water utilities and sewer utilities, it is typically developed on a cash basis. What that means is you're projecting everything on a cash expenditure, cash out, and all the revenues as cash in. So that's how it's typically done from a financial planning perspective. So when you do this diligence, what you're really evaluating is not only the overall funding gap that you're projecting, given what you're doing now, what you're not doing now, where you want to go. You're not only getting an overall level funding gap, but as I just mentioned in the previous chart, you also get a good lens into what's the annual level of revenue requirements, and then balancing it to have some level of a steady state over the first 3-4 years. And the way you balance it to have some steady state is, again, by looking at a combination of cash financing versus debt financing. Typically, the O&M expenditures, if there are certain things that you want to ramp up in 2 years, you may realize, hey, I can't do it in 2 years. Maybe I have to ramp it up over 4 years. Similarly, capital program, you may realize I can't do it as fast as I want to do. Maybe certain slightly low priority projects, I may want to push out a little bit. So that's a balancing act you really have to do. But the most important thing also is to really actively look for low-cost capital financing. Because one thing we find, we do in Black & Veatch, we do a stormwater survey every 2 years. And an interesting phenomenon we find for utilities that have established a stormwater user fee program, still there is a very strong tendency to keep on doing cash financing and being a little bit averse to doing debt financing. Whereas if you look at the more mature water and sewer industry, they tend to lean towards a good balance of debt financing and cash financing. So you have to really look at your individual circumstances to see whether it's possible to do debt financing. But sometimes utilities may be completely capped out and may not be able to do any debt financing. Then that's fine. Then you have to adjust it and try to initially start with some capital cash financing. Those are something to really look at. And lastly, again, is to try to have some level of consistent annual funding when you're establishing the first 5-year financial plan, so that you can then build some good history, and then as you're developing the stormwater utility program. So that's really what we wanted to cover today, starting with the foundation of the program cost, and then how do you build a financial plan. And we will do a deeper dive into some of the policies in the next session. Trisha, I think, Dana, we can open it to questions.
Sure. Thank you, Prabha. Thank you, Elizabeth. That